My name is Soong-Chan Rah. I'm 51 years old, and I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and came to the United States a few weeks after my 6th birthday. My father came to the US first. My mom and my 3 sisters and I were in Korea for about a year and a half, while my dad tried to kind of make a living and try to establish himself here in the United States. By the time he settled on work here in the United States, he was a graphic artist, so he was working for a sign company, helping to design signs and do layout of signs. And so that's what he was doing when we moved to the United States. Because he wasn't your typical immigrant worker doing kind of non-skilled labor, he was doing skilled labor. I remember he always had trouble keeping a job, actually, when we first got to the United States. So eventually he actually ended up opening his own business because he felt like he really couldn't work with other people. Back then when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, I didn't quite understand that, but many years later I understand kind of the pressures that he might have felt as a Korean immigrant, trying to fit into American society and doing what is more skilled labor than unskilled labor, and being questioned about it quite a bit. And so I think that's why he opened his own business, which really didn't do too well, to be honest about it. This was not like a Korean-American success story where he opened a business and did really well. The business struggled quite a bit, and he had a lot of skills, but business wasn't one of them. He could do graphic art and things of that nature, but really didn't do much when it came to running a business. I guess because my dad's work was always inconsistent and the business didn't do too well, my mom ended up working and kind of working outside of the house as well. And she actually took on a job as a nurse's aide in a nearby nursing home. And I think there are a lot of different factors here. It's a long history behind that, but my parents had very significant marital struggles. And eventually my dad actually left our home. It meant that my mom actually had to take on even more financial responsibility for the family. So my mom ended up taking two jobs to try to keep the family together for 4 kids and herself. So we ended up moving to inner city Baltimore just because the rent was cheaper, the housing costs were lower. And my mom ended up working 2 jobs from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. She would work in an inner city carryout. One of those grocery stores / food places in a rough part of Baltimore. That's kind of redundant, but it was the rough part of Baltimore City. She worked at a place where, had the bulletproof glass and plexiglass to protect the servers, and Lazy Susan to pass the food and the money and the back and forth. She worked all day from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. at that carryout, takeout place. Then, because that wasn't enough money for the family, she would go to a night shift, and she had done some work as a nurse's aide. So from like 11 p.m. to about 7 a.m., she would work the night shift at a nursing home, where she would, change the bedpans and be on call for the elderly citizens at the senior citizen home. Then she would rush home and make breakfast for the kids, send us off to school, sleep maybe 2 hours, and then go back to work again. So I saw my mom do this 20 hours a day, 6 days a week for several years, mainly to keep the family together. She was a very committed Christian, and so she would work 6 days a week, 20 hours a day, but she would always take Sunday and go to church. But I remember the example that she set for her children, that you work hard and you provide for your children, but you also are faithful to your church. And that was something that she really modeled for us. She never really had to say anything about it. She just modeled it for us. She did this for many years. I do remember a very specific moment where my mom showed her vulnerability to her family. And my dad had stopped by, and he would stop by once in a while, just, I don't know what he would do, but sometimes he would drink and leave like beer in the refrigerator. One time he'd stop by during the day while I was there, and then he left when my mom got home at night. And I guess my mom was just kind of exhausted, so she drank a couple of the beers. And it was the first time I'd ever seen my mom do anything like that, drink. She never smoked in her entire life. That might have been the only time I ever saw her drink in 85 years of her life. But I saw her like emotionally spent. And as she, took a couple of sips of that beer, her shoulders slumped. And I could see, even as a 10-year-old, that this was a very tired woman who had worked very hard to try to keep her family together. But the weight of that got to her. And to see a single mom who who had worked very hard as an immigrant mom to keep her family together, for her shoulders to slump, to show that even just that slight moment of weakness. I don't think I will ever forget that. But all the other times, she was extraordinarily strong. And she had to be. She had no choice. She had 4 kids to raise. She didn't speak much English. She took the job she could get, which was working in an inner city carryout and working the night shift at a nursing home. But it was through that she raised 4 kids and raised all of us to hopefully be good people and to be hard workers and to be those who are faithful and those who are loyal and to be committed believers and those who care for others. And she really exemplified and modeled that for us. When we moved to Columbia out of inner city Baltimore, and she had worked really hard. And I remember when we first bought that house in the suburbs. And you know, it takes a while for the house to close, and it takes a while to settle into a, So I remember we had bought it, we had put a bid in, and it had still not been closed. But every Sunday for about 3 months, we would drive down there and just kind of drive around the neighborhood and look at the house. And finally, when the closing occurred and the house officially became the family house, just the pride and joy in her face that she had gotten out of a bad neighborhood, and we were now living in a suburban neighborhood with our own house that she had actually paid for. The sense of pride that my mom very much deserved to have at that moment. I remember around this time was when the then current president of the United States would say things like, there are welfare queens that are taking advantage of our government. And what he was describing could be what my mom was doing, which was we were on food stamps. We were on government subsidized housing. We were, in some sense, getting help from the government. And the implication was those who got help from the government were lazy, didn't work hard. That's why they had to get help from the government. You know, there's nobody that worked as hard as my mom. No one who sacrificed as much as my mom did for her children. And so when there's rhetoric around lazy immigrants, it is a visceral, personal reaction from me to say, you don't know the story. You don't know the story. Yeah, you don't know my mom. And how dare you label someone a welfare queen? Yeah, there was government subsidies on the housing that we had. It was roach infested. It was gang infested. It was one of the worst housing places that you could live. But that was the only place we could afford to live, in government subsidized housing. And to tell someone who worked hard, still couldn't make ends meet, that they're a welfare queen, was really devastating. But my mom did work hard to get us out and to get us into a neighborhood like Columbia. Once that settled, and she was able to make mortgage payments, and she actually didn't have to work those 2 jobs anymore. So when I was in high school, she worked 1 job, and it was for the Hilton. And she was a prep chef for breakfast and lunch at the Hilton. She would have to still get up early in the morning. She would get up at 5 and get to her job at about 5:30 to help set up the food for the breakfast buffet, and then help set up lunch, and then she'll come home in the afternoon. But she was home in the evenings now. And for the first time in her life, she had health insurance. She didn't have it before. She was working these part-time jobs and mom and pop places that couldn't afford health insurance. So she was now working for a big company, and she had health insurance. So, she had a bout with cancer, and the health insurance was able to cover that. She had some, physical challenges, but they were dealt with because she had health insurance. I think that's when things began to turn, that she had a job that, provided for the needs that she had, but also she had a home that she had paid for, and knew that there was going to be a security for her family. It was interesting, a few years ago, a friend of mine was doing a documentary about immigration, and he wanted to take me back to my old neighborhood where I grew up in Baltimore. After we had done this kind of scenes of footage around the neighborhood, we went to my mom's, she was living in an assisted living senior citizen facility, and we set up lights, and my friend was videotaping. And I started asking her about do you remember, Mom, when we lived in that bad neighborhood in Baltimore? And do you remember how long hours you had to work? And she said something that was both amazing and frustrating to me. She said, I don't really remember any of that. I'm just so happy now that I have 4 kids that have grown up well. They have wonderful families, and they have nice homes, and they have beautiful grandchildren. They've given me beautiful grandchildren. And so I try to bring it back. I said, Mom, but remember remember all the roaches we had in our house? And remember, I would freak out because I hated being alone in that house. And remember, you would be so tired at the end of 20 hours of work. And she would again say, yeah, that's not important right now. But what's more important is that I'm blessed because I've got 4 children who've grown up well, who have wonderful families of their own, and they have. And it was this went on for about an hour. And I would keep saying, Mom, don't you remember what happened? And she would keep coming back to, but this is where, and she would use this language, this is where God has brought me now, though. This is the life that I'm blessed with now. And that's what she chose to focus on. And she didn't gripe about, I gripe more about my upbringing than I gripe more about the neighborhood we lived in. And I, remember that more, maybe more emotionally. But for her, those many, many years of working long hours, those many, many years of suffering, in that sense, she's like, yeah, it feels like a long time ago, and I don't even want to think about that because where I am now is really blessed. That was something from someone who had been through as much as she had, to be at a place where she could say something like that. My mom's 85, and she has Alzheimer's, and so her memory's not as sharp as it used to be. She has, pretty decent long-term memory, but short-term stuff she really still struggles with. She still has a very positive outlook, and that's what I mean by, even though she suffered, she still can think about the very good things that have happened in her life, the many ways that she has overcome suffering. This might sound a little preachy, but when she was in her 60s, and this was before the Alzheimer's diagnosis, she kind of showed me the condition of her knees. And most of us have 1 kneecap on each knee. She actually has 5 on each knee. Because in addition to working 20 hours a day, she would pray about an hour a day. And she would kneel before God on a hard wooden floor and just pray for her children and her grandchildren. She did this for 50 years. She still does this to some extent, even though her mind is not as sharp as it used to be. When you are on your knees an hour a day for 40, 50 years, your kneecaps just can't take that kind of pressure. So what they did is they cracked open. And after all those years of praying, so now when she kneels, her kneecaps crack open and conform to the shape of the wood floor. That's some dedication. So when I think about what does it mean to be an immigrant parent, what does it mean to be someone who was rejected by society, who was called names by a president, in short, who was told that, well, you're a freeloader because you're taking food stamps, but yet to be strong enough and to have enough of an identity that she is able to pray for the well-being of her children, work long hours to give opportunities for her children. I guess that's what it means to be an immigrant parent. That's what it means to want the best for your children. That's the kind of life that she lived. And that's why I'm thrilled that even though she's struggling with Alzheimer's now, most of her life now is spent in rest and contentment, that her children are well, her grandchildren are doing well. She's now a great-grandmother. My niece had a child not a couple of years ago, and her great-grandchildren are going to do well. And all that hard work, there was a payoff. And not so much that we got material wealth or anything of that sort, but that she did well and she was faithful. So my dad was in and out of our lives, but towards the end of his life, one, he was probably struggling with Alzheimer's himself, but he had a number of mini strokes towards the end of his life. And as a result of that, he kind of came back to my mom while she was still living on her own at the time, and all the kids had grown and gotten married and had left the house. And she knew he was not well, so she took him back and allowed him to live in her home. I remember hearing that and I was just livid. I was furious. And I didn't yell at my mom, but I was like, you can't do this. You know, he abandoned you for 40 years and now he's at the end of his life and he's sick and he wants to come back and you're taking care of him. And she did. In fact, not long after he came back home to my mom, he had a major stroke and ended up in the hospital. And they actually never officially divorced. So because they never officially divorced, technically any medical bills that he would accrue would end up on my mom. And I was furious again. I was like, how could you let this happen? But I remember her words. She's like, you and I are the Christians in this family, and this is what we do. We forgive, and we extend grace. And I was a pastor at the time, so what am I going to say? I was like, stop being graceful, stop being forgiving. I couldn't, and this is my mom, I couldn't say anything. But she took him back, and then cousin was there for him during the end of his life. That example really struck me. So I was living in Boston at the time, and we had, my daughter was 2. I flew down and spent some time with him. And in fact, one time I got a call in Boston that he's probably not going to make it through the weekend, so I flew down. And I'm at his bedside, and my oldest sister, my second oldest sister says, we gotta have a family meeting. So all the siblings and my mom go to the waiting room. And it struck me. I was like, my dad's gonna die in a day or two. You know, they're planning a funeral. They're calling all the pastors to come and get this thing going. So I left the meeting and went back to my dad's room. Maybe following the example of my mom, I asked my dad for forgiveness. That sounds strange, given that he had abandoned me. But I asked for forgiveness because I realized I had hated him for so long, and that hate was kind of eating away at me. And so I clenched his hand, and I said, Dad, I need you to forgive me because I've hated you, and that wasn't right. He couldn't speak. The stroke had really taken that away, but he started crying, and the one good hand he had, he squeezed my hand. 2 days later, he passed. But my mom set the example. You know, when a person asks for forgiveness, you forgive. When a person seeks grace, you extend it. And so, you know, 2 days before he passed, there was, in my mind, a reconciliation. And for me, you know, even after his death, processing a lot of this really kind of struck home. Like several years ago, I could not have said, my dad struggled in this world because he was an immigrant man, Korean man, trying to make it in a white man's world. I didn't understand it when I was 7, 8 years old and 10 years old living in inner city Baltimore. Why are we living in this roach-infested house, apartment complex? I understand a little bit better now what it means to be an outsider and to really struggle with that and to not feel affirmed in one's identity as a Korean immigrant man. I'm going to choose to react differently to it, but I understand, I have a little more empathy with what my dad probably went through when he first came to the United States. My name is Soong-Chan Rah, and this is my Korean American story.